What if the very place you were told to find hope, Nan, is the same place quietly draining your future? What if the hands you trust for blessings are the same hands redirecting your destiny? And what if the problem was never your faith, but the system built around it? Because across Africa today, millions are praying harder than ever before, yet somehow life is not getting better. Why? Stay with me. Africa is one of the most religious continents on earth. Churches are full. Mosques are overflowing. Prayer meetings stretch deep into the night. Faith is not lacking. Yet unemployment remains high. A poverty persists. A leadership crises continue. A economic instability defines daily life. Now pause and think. How can a people so deeply connected to God still struggle this consistently? Is it a coincidence, or is something fundamentally wrong? Historical context. Before the arrival, to understand the present, we must return to the past. Long before the arrival of foreign religions, Africa was not spiritually empty. It was deeply structured. Across kingdoms, empires, and communities, spirituality was integrated into everyday life, not as a tool of control, but as a system of balance. In ancient African societies, spirituality reinforced ethics. Leaders were accountable to both people and tradition. Belief systems emphasized harmony with nature and community religion. Religion was not an industry. It was identity. It was lived. It was embodied. It was inseparable from reality. Spiritual authority was not centralized. It was communal. And most importantly, it was not for sale. Then came the turning point. The arrival of Christianity and Islam, first through trade, then through scholarship, then through conquest, and later through colonial expansion. But these religions did not arrive alone. They came with new power structures, a new hierarchies, a new systems of authority with European explorers, traders, and colonizers. Dadajialas came, not just goods and guns, but doctrine. Christian missionaries arrived under the banner of salvation. Islam, already present in parts of North and West Africa, expanded into more structured institutional forms. And slowly, spiritual leadership began to shift. From community-based guidance to centralized authority, shared belief to controlled doctrine. And over time, a new class emerged. A class of individuals who could speak on behalf of God, and whose words could not easily be questioned. This was the foundation. And from this foundation, something far more complex would emerge. To understand today's reality, we must look beyond religion itself and examine those who control it. Because not all religious leaders are the same. Some guide, some uplift, some transform lives, but others exploit, manipulate, and build empires on the vulnerability of others. Here is the uncomfortable truth. There is a growing class of dubious religious leaders who have turned faith into a highly profitable system. Not spirituality, not service, but business. And the product they sell is hope. At first glance, modern religious movements across Africa appear vibrant. Mega churches, mass gatherings, charismatic leaders. But beneath this surface lies a system that operates with precision. Every powerful system understands one thing. People are most influenceable when they are in need. And across many African societies, need is abundant. Economic instability, limited healthcare, unemployment, social uncertainty. These conditions create something critical, emotional vulnerability. And vulnerability is where influence begins. Once inside, the message shifts. You are not limited by your circumstances, Janji. You are limited by your faith. Suddenly, Poverty becomes a spiritual attack. Illness becomes a curse. A failure becomes lack of belief. Structural problems are reframed as spiritual problems. And if the problem is spiritual, then the solution must be spiritual. At this stage, something critical happens. Faith becomes transactional. You must sow to reap. Your sacrifice determines your breakthrough. Give, and God will multiply it. These statements, often rooted in Scripture, are reframed into economic mechanisms. Giving becomes a requirement, a condition, a contract, and slowly, belief is monetized. In today's Africa, religion is no longer only a belief system. It is a multi-billion-dollar economy. From sprawling megachurches to roadside prayer camps, from televised sermons to digital offerings, faith has been transformed into a product. And like every product, it is packaged, it is branded, it is sold. Hope is powerful. For individuals facing poverty, illness, unemployment, a systemic instability, hope becomes a lifeline. And where there is demand, there will always be supply. Religious leaders offer, your breakthrough is coming. Your miracle is near. Your suffering has meaning. But often, there is a condition. Sow a seed, pay a tithe, give an offering. Faith becomes transactional, and salvation becomes conditional. The business model of belief behind the pulp structure. Every powerful system understands one thing. People are most influenceable when they are in need. And across many African societies, need is abundant. Economic instability, limited health care, unemployment, social uncertainty. These conditions create something critical, emotional vulnerability. And vulnerability is where influence begins. Once inside, the message shifts. You are not limited by your circumstances. You are limited by your faith. Suddenly, poverty becomes a spiritual attack. Illness becomes a curse. A failure becomes lack of belief. Structural problems are reframed as spiritual problems. And if the problem is spiritual, then the solution must be spiritual. Revenue streams include tithes and offerings, special donations, a prophetic consultations, religious merchandise, a paid conferences. In some cases, religious organizations command more financial power than local governments. Yet, they remain largely unregulated. Because faith is sacred, and questioning it is seen as rebellion. Imagine a young man in Lagos, educated, ambitious, but unemployed. Months turn into years. Applications go unanswered. Bills pile up. Frustration becomes desperation. One Sunday, he walks into a church. The atmosphere is electric. Music swells. Voices rise. Hope fills the air. The pastor speaks Nord, and it feels personal. Your delay is not denial. Your breakthrough is one seat away. For the first time in months, he feels seen. He gives, not because he is foolish, but because he is human. Weeks pass, nothing changes. So he gives again, and again, until giving becomes a pattern, knowledge and hope becomes dependency. Now imagine a mother, 2 children, rising costs, uncertain future. She is told your financial breakthrough is tied to your obedience. She gives her last savings. She waits. Nothing changes. So she gives again. This is not an isolated story. It is a pattern, a system, a cycle. The system does not survive on money alone. It survives on control. Fear is a tool, you are told. A questioning the leader is questioning God. A leaving invites spiritual attack. A disobedience leads to failure. Fear becomes a cage. And once fear is established, freedom disappears. Dependency creation followers are conditioned to depend on a prophecies, a visions. A spiritual instructions decisions are no longer personal. They are outsourced. And that is where power shifts. Collapse of critical thinking over time. People stop asking a why, a how, a what if, because questioning is framed as rebellion. And in a system where questioning is suppressed, progress slows. At this point, something deeper has happened. Faith has not disappeared. It has been transformed, restructured, institutionalized, commercialized. And now, it is deeply intertwined with a power of politics, economics, identity, but the real question is no longer, is faith important? The question is, who controls it and to what end? Because in the next phase of this story, we move beyond individuals into systems, into governments, into alliances, into the machinery that sustains everything you have just seen. To fully understand the machinery of modern religion in Africa, we must move beyond the pulpit and step into the corridors of power. Because faith, in today's context, is not only spiritual, it is political, it is economic, and in many cases, it is strategic. Religion as political capital in many African societies, religious institutions command immense influence, not just over belief, but over behavior. Nay, voting patterns, a public opinion, a moral legitimacy for politicians. This influence is invaluable. An endorsement from a powerful religious leader can translate into millions of loyal voters, instant credibility, emotional trust that no policy speech can generate, and so, a quiet alliance forms. The unspoken exchange, the relationship, is rarely documented, but it is widely understood. Politicians offer protection, a funding, access to state resources, a legal leniency. Religious leaders offer a public endorsement, narrative control, a moral justification. It is not always explicit, but it is profoundly effective. But what happens when institutions that should challenge power become aligned with it? Who speaks for the people when the voice of influence is compromised? In many cases, silence becomes the norm. Systemic failures are reframed as spiritual attacks, a test of faith, a divine timing, and accountability is deferred. Colonial echoes, modern manipulation's history does not disappear. It evolves. The strategies once used during colonial rule have not vanished. They have adapted. The psychology of dependence. Colonial systems thrived on one principle: dependence. Dependence on external authority. Dependence on external validation. Dependence on external solutions. And today, that pattern persists. But instead of colonial administrators, the authority figures have changed. From external control to internalized control, the most powerful systems of control are not enforced. They are internalized. When individuals begin to police their own thoughts, fear their own questions, silence their own doubts, then control no longer requires force. It becomes self-sustaining. The rebranding of power. Modern religious institutions often present themselves as centers of hope, safe havens, moral authorities, and many genuinely serve these roles. But within this framework, power operates, not always visibly, but always structurally. And like all systems of power, it seeks to sustain itself. To understand a system, we must observe it in motion. A man begins with a vision, a small gathering, a message of hope. People listen, they connect, they return. The gathering grows. Soon it becomes an institution. But growth brings complexity. Expenses rise. Expectations increase. influence expands. And slowly, the message begins to shift. Not dramatically, not suddenly. From serve the people to sustain the system. A woman wakes before dawn. She prays. She prepares her children. She works tirelessly. Every week, she gives, not because she is forced, but because she believes, because she hopes, because she trusts. Years pass. Her faith remains strong, but her circumstances remain unchanged. And still, she gives, because to stop would feel like losing everything. Then there is the questioner, the one who begins to notice patterns, who asks, why does this system operate this way? Who benefits? What is the evidence? But questioning comes at a cost. Isolation, a criticism, accusations of rebellion, because in systems built on certainty, questions are disruptive. The impact of this system is not confined to individuals. It extends into the fabric of society. Billions flow into religious institutions annually. Yet, many communities remain underdeveloped. Resources that could fund education, entrepreneurship, innovation are redirected into religious empires, consumption structures, personality-driven systems. This is not merely a financial issue. It is a structural one. In some contexts, critical thinking is discouraged. Faith is elevated above inquiry, and knowledge becomes secondary to belief. A generation raised this way struggles to innovate, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never trained to question. When leaders are perceived as divinely appointed, accountability weakens. And without accountability, systems stagnate. A society conditioned to follow without questioning will struggle to produce leaders who challenge systems. This phenomenon is not isolated. It spans Nigeria, a Kenya, a Ghana, a South Africa, and beyond. But its implications are global. Because when large populations are economically drained, intellectually suppressed, it affects a global markets, a migration flows, a geopolitical stability, but this is not a story of despair. It is a story of awareness. And awareness is the beginning of change. Spirituality does not need to be abandoned. It needs to be reclaimed, separated from exploitation, grounded in authenticity, returned to its original purpose, meaning a balance. The ethical guidance, faith, and critical thinking are not enemies. They can coexist, but only when questioning is allowed. A healthy system invites inquiry, not suppresses it. Religious institutions must evolve with transparency, ethical governance, financial accountability, a social responsibility. Because power without accountability always leads to abuse. Resources must be redirected toward education, skill development, entrepreneurship, innovation. Because no society grows by consuming more than it produces. Africa must reconnect with its intellectual traditions, its problem-solving heritage, its identity beyond external validation. Because development begins with self-definition. Africa stands at a crossroads, not between faith and doubt, but between awareness and illusion, empowerment and dependency. A truth and comfort faith will always be part of the human story, but the form it takes is a choice, a collective choice. Because when faith is aligned with truth, it liberates. When it is aligned with power, it dominates. And when it is turned into an industry, it consumes. So we return to the question we began with. What if the problem was never your faith, but the system built around it? Because faith, in its purest form, should empower you, not control you, not exploit you, not keep you stuck. Africa does not lack belief. It does not lack potential. It does not lack strength. What it must confront is the system that quietly redirects all three. Because the future of the continent will not be determined by how much people pray, but by how well they think, question, build, act, and take responsibility. Somewhere between salvation and survival, between devotion and dependency, a final question remains. When faith becomes business and hope becomes currency, who truly benefits? And more importantly, who pays the price? But perhaps there is another question we have not asked, not about loss, but about possibility. Because if billions can be generated through belief, if millions can be mobilized through devotion, if structures this vast can be built, sustained, and expanded, without central government control, without formal economic planning, then what we are witnessing is not just a system of faith. It is a system of power, a system of coordination, a system of economic potential. And that leads us to a thought that is both simple and deeply unsettling. What if the issue is not that Africa lacks capacity, but that its capacity has been directed differently? Because what we call worship may also be workforce. What we call offerings may also be capital. What we call devotion may also be discipline. And if that is true, then we are not just looking at religion. We are looking at something far greater. We are looking at an unbuilt economy. What if every cathedral of worship was a cathedral of production? What if every offering basket was an investment fund? What if every weekly gathering of millions was a coordinated workforce? Pause. Imagine this. The same energy, the same discipline, the same loyalty, but redirected from prayer halls to production lines, from tithes to industrial capital, from miracles to manufacturing. What would Africa look like today if its largest spiritual institutions were also its greatest economic engines? Would the continent still struggle with unemployment? Would its youth still migrate in search of opportunity? Would its vast natural resources still leave as raw materials, only to return as expensive finished goods? Or would Africa stand today as one of the most powerful industrial forces in the world? To understand this question, we must first understand a forgotten truth. Africa was not always a consumer continent. It was a producer civilization. Long before colonial disruption, African societies built advanced iron smelting technologies, complex textile industries, thriving agricultural systems, expansive trade networks. Empires such as Mali, Songhai, and Benin were not sustained by faith alone. They were sustained by production, organization, and economic systems. Spirituality existed, but it did not replace productivity. It complemented it. Then came disruption. Colonialism did not just take land. It restructured economies. Africa was repositioned not as a producer of finished goods, but as a supplier of raw materials. Gold, cocoa, rubber, oil, extracted, exported, and transformed elsewhere. Alongside this economic restructuring came a psychological shift. Religious institutions expanded rapidly, and over time, they became some of the most organized, resource-rich, and influential systems on the continent. But here lies the paradox. Africa possesses abundant natural resources, a massive youthful population, strong communal structures, and yet its most organized large-scale systems are often not industrial, but religious. Across Africa today, mega-churches represent one of the most powerful forms of organization. They mobilize millions of people weekly, billions in financial contributions, highly structured leadership systems, massive physical infrastructure. Now imagine if this same structure was applied to industry. Every week, millions gather, disciplined, coordinated, committed. This is not chaos. It is organization. It is human capital at scale. In industrial economies, such coordination powers manufacturing plants, assembly lines, logistics systems. But in this context, it powers worship. What if each congregation functioned as a cooperative workforce, a production unit, a skills development hub? The same individuals who gather weekly could be engineers, technicians, fabricators, innovators, not just spiritually engaged, but economically empowered. The financial capacity of megachurches is immense. Weekly contributions, monthly donations, special offerings. In economic terms, sadajactus. This represents liquidity. If even a fraction of these funds were systematically invested in manufacturing, agriculture, technology, infrastructure, the impact would be transformational. Countries that industrialized successfully did not lack faith, but they prioritized production over consumption, investment over distribution. Megachurches already possess large-scale infrastructure, land, assets, organizational networks. These are the same foundational elements required. Factories, industrial parks, business clusters. The difference is not capability. It is direction. Megachurches operate with hierarchical leadership, departmental systems, communication networks, event coordination at scale. These are not small achievements. They mirror corporate structures. Imagine if departments were aligned to production units, supply chains, research and development, if sermons were complemented by skill acquisition programs, industrial training, entrepreneurial incubation, the result would not just be spiritual growth, but economic transformation. Let us imagine, not fiction, but possibility. In this Africa, mega churches evolved, not away from faith, but into dual institutions, spiritual centers and economic engines. Members gather on Sunday and work in coordinated production systems during the week. The same sense of belonging now fuels productivity. Instead of exporting raw materials, Africa exports finished electronics, textiles, machinery, processed agricultural goods. Unemployment drops. Because every institution is also a training ground. Healthcare improves, education expands, infrastructure grows, not through dependency, but through internally generated capacity. This is not a fantasy. It is a model, one that has existed in different forms across other regions of the world. Across the globe, institutions evolved to meet societal needs. In East Asia, communal discipline fueled industrialization. In Europe, institutional structures drove economic expansion. In North America, organized systems created corporate empires. Africa has the structure, has the people, has the resources, but the alignment remains fragmented. The question is not capability, it is prioritization. What does this reveal? Africa is not disorganized. Its organization is simply concentrated in different domains. The same energy that builds massive congregations can build massive industries. They can coexist. But balance is essential. Hope alone cannot industrialize a continent. Systems can. Africa does not lack belief. It does not lack strength. It does not lack potential. What it faces is a question of alignment. If the structures that unite millions were also the structures that build economies, the story would be different. But the future is not fixed. It is shaped by choices, by priorities, by vision. So perhaps the real question is not work. What if mega churches were industries? But rather, what will Africa choose to build? with the power it already has. The question now shifts from imagination to possibility. Could Africa's megachurches realistically evolve into economic engines? Or is this merely an intellectual exercise, a compelling idea with no structural grounding? Across the world, there are precedents, not identical, but instructive. In parts of Asia, communal structures rooted in discipline and shared identity were transformed into industrial ecosystems. In Europe, religious institutions historically funded schools, hospitals, early economic cooperatives. In Latin America, faith-based organizations have supported microfinance systems, community production networks. The principle is simple. Where people are organized, economies can be built. And in Africa, few institutions organize people at scale like megachurches. Transformation, however, is not automatic. It requires intention, design, and discipline. If megachurches were to evolve into economic industrial hubs, they would need to integrate. Congregations would become learning communities, technical training hubs, innovation incubators, teaching not only theology, but engineering, manufacturing, digital skills, agricultural processing. Members not only give, they would own. Through cooperative shares, community-owned enterprises, collective investment funds. This shifts the model from donation to consumption to investment to production to shared prosperity. Instead of building only auditoriums, institutions would invest in processing plants, perhaps the most critical element, governance. Because without transparency, any system, spiritual or economic, can be exploited. This would require financial accountability, independent oversight, ethical leadership structures. But structure alone is not enough. There is a deeper challenge: culture. For decades, faith has been positioned as a place of refuge, a space for miracles, a solution to hardship. Shifting this narrative requires redefining faith itself, not as escape, but as empowerment. Every system protects itself, and when systems are powerful, they resist change. The existing structure works. For some, it generates influence, wealth, authority, and transformation would disrupt this balance. If financial flows shift from centralized control to collective ownership, power changes hands, and power is rarely surrendered voluntarily. For followers, the current model also provides comfort, certainty, identity, community. Even if it does not provide economic transformation, wasum, it provides emotional stability. And that is powerful. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty can feel like risk. But without risk, there is no transformation. Africa today stands at a defining moment. It is home to the world's youngest population, vast natural resources, expanding urban centers, growing digital connectivity. And yet, it continues to export raw materials and import finished products. This is not a resource problem. It is a value creation problem. Every raw material exported represents lost opportunity, lost jobs, lost industries, lost value. Now imagine if organized institutions like megachurches participated in wine processing, manufacturing, distribution. The multiplier effect would be enormous. Africa's youth are not waiting. They are building startups, learning skills, creating solutions. The question is, will existing institutions evolve to support them or remain disconnected from this transformation? Faith does not need to disappear. It needs to expand. Faith can inspire discipline, integrity, vision, but it must also encourage action. Giving is noble, But building is transformative. Faith should not only teach patience, it should also teach innovation, problem-solving, ownership. If Africa were to harness its existing structures, what would a transformation blueprint look like? Recognizing the potential, understanding the imbalance, integrating technical training, economic literacy, critical thinking, launching small-scale cooperative industries, community production hubs, expanding successful models across regions. Aligning faith, economy, governance. Africa's story has never been one of absence. It has always been one of potential. The structures exist. The people are ready. The resources are abundant. What remains is alignment. Because the difference between a gathering and a workforce, creation, a donation, and an investment, a sermon, and a strategy is not capacity. It is choice. And so, we return to the question, if megachurches in Africa were industries, what would the continent look like today? Perhaps more importantly, what could it still become tomorrow?